Eat from the trash and I'll give you $1. The man in the expensive suit laughed, pointing at the dumpster behind the restaurant. His friends joined in, their laughter echoing through the Atlanta alley. 8-year-old Zara Johnson stood perfectly still, her small hands gripping a crumpled piece of paper. Her clothes were worn but clean, her hair neatly braided despite everything. She looked up at the tall man with calm, steady eyes. "My mama taught me something, mister," she said quietly, her voice cutting through their laughter like a knife. She said dignity isn't something you can buy or sell, and it's definitely not something you can take away from someone, no matter how much money you have. The laughter stopped instantly. Richard Stone, billionaire CEO of Stone Industries, felt his smile freeze on his face. This little girl, standing in an alley where she shouldn't have to be, had just said something that hit him harder than any business deal ever could. Behind her, the sound of a wheelchair squeaked softly. Her mother appeared, struggling to move forward on the uneven pavement, watching her daughter with eyes full of both pride and worry. What happened next would change everything. If you're someone who appreciates emotional stories, we'd love for you to like and subscribe. There's more to come that might move you too. Earlier that day, Zara had been sitting on the floor of their tiny one-room apartment, carefully counting coins. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Her mother, Michelle, watched from her wheelchair, her face tight with worry. "We have $4.37, Mama," Zara announced, organizing the coins into neat piles. "That's enough for bread and maybe some peanut butter." Michelle's heart broke a little more each day watching her 8-year-old daughter handle responsibilities that should never belong to a child. The accident 2 years ago had changed everything. One moment she was walking to work at the diner, the next she was waking up in a hospital bed told she would never walk again. The medical bills had swallowed their savings. The insurance barely covered anything. Their landlord had been patient, but even patience has limits. "Baby, you don't need to worry about money," Michelle said softly, though they both knew it wasn't true. "That's Mama's job." Zara looked up with those serious brown eyes that seemed too old for her face. "We're a team, remember? You take care of the important stuff, and I help with the small things." The small things. Michelle almost laughed, but it would have come out as a sob. Grocery shopping, laundry at the laundromat, cleaning the apartment, making sure they had enough quarters for the bus. These weren't small things. They were survival. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days. The walls were thin, and they could hear their neighbors arguing, laughing, and crying through the paper-thin walls. The elevator had been broken for 6 months, which meant Michelle couldn't leave unless someone carried her wheelchair down the stairs. Most days, that someone was Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, but she worked double shifts at the hospital and wasn't always available. The apartment itself was barely 300 square feet. A fold-out couch served as Zara's bed at night. A small kitchenette in the corner had a mini fridge that made strange humming noises, and a hot plate with only one working burner. The bathroom was so small that Michelle's wheelchair barely fit through the door. They had hung a curtain to separate the sleeping area from the rest of the room, giving them both a tiny bit of privacy. Zara had learned to be quiet, responsible, and invisible when she needed to. She spoke like a little adult, but still slept with a raggedy teddy bear that had been a gift from her grandmother before she passed away last year. The bear's fur was matted, and one eye was missing, but it was the only thing left from the life they used to have. "Mama, I was thinking," Zara said, still organizing the coins. "Maybe I could ask Mr. Peterson at the corner store if I can help sweep or something. He always seems busy." "Absolutely not," Michelle said firmly. "You're 8 years old, Zara. You should be playing, not working." "But I like helping," Zara insisted. "And we need—" "We'll figure it out," Michelle interrupted, though she had no idea how. The rent was due in 5 days, and they were short by almost $200. She had applied for every assistance program she could find, but the waiting lists were long and the requirements were strict. The social worker had told her that single mothers with disabilities were priority cases, but apparently there were a lot of priority cases in Atlanta. Michelle remembered when she used to complain about being tired after an 8-hour shift at the diner. Now she would give anything to be able to stand for 8 hours, to earn a paycheck, to provide for her daughter the way a mother should. The disability payments barely covered their rent, let alone food, utilities, and everything else they needed. She watched Zara carefully stack the quarters, her small fingers precise and careful. This child had never complained, not once. When kids at school asked why she always wore the same 3 outfits, Zara would simply say they were her favorites. When the other children brought elaborate lunches, Zara would eat her peanut butter sandwich like it was a feast. When mothers picked up their children in nice cars, Zara would wave goodbye and walk to the bus stop without a word of complaint. That afternoon, they took the bus downtown. Michelle had an appointment at the social services office, hoping to get approved for additional food assistance. The bus ride cost them their last $2, but the appointment was too important to miss. Zara brought a coloring book and some broken crayons, settling quietly in the plastic chair beside her mother while they waited. The waiting room was full of people who looked just like them, tired, worried, holding folders full of paperwork and hope. A baby cried in the corner while his teenage mother bounced him gently. An elderly man sat alone, staring at his hands. A woman about Michelle's age kept checking the clock on the wall, probably worried about getting back to work. When Michelle's name was finally called, she wheeled into the cramped office with Zara walking quietly beside her. The caseworker, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, reviewed their file. "I see you've been approved for $60 a month in food assistance," she said, not looking up from the paperwork. $60? Michelle's voice cracked. "That's not even enough for a week." "I understand, Mrs. Johnson, but with your current income from disability and the housing assistance you're receiving, that's what the formula calculates. You can appeal the decision, but it typically takes 3 to 6 months." Michelle felt the walls closing in. 3 to 6 months might as well be forever when you're choosing between rent and food every month. The appointment didn't go well. More paperwork, more waiting, more "we'll call you." Michelle tried to hide her disappointment, but Zara noticed everything. She always did. "It's okay, Mama," Zara whispered as they left the building. "God will make a way. That's what Grandma used to say." They had missed the 3:30 bus and couldn't afford another fare, so they started walking. Michelle's wheelchair wasn't meant for long distances, and her hands were getting sore from pushing the wheels. The sidewalks in downtown Atlanta weren't built with wheelchairs in mind. Some corners didn't have ramps, forcing them to go blocks out of their way to find a path that worked. When they passed a fancy restaurant in the business district, Zara noticed people in expensive clothes eating at outdoor tables, laughing and talking loudly. The restaurant was called Meridian, and even from the sidewalk, they could smell the delicious food. Well-dressed waiters moved between tables, carrying plates that probably cost more than Michelle and Zara spent on food in a month. "They look happy," Zara observed, watching a woman laugh so hard she nearly spilled her wine. "Money doesn't buy happiness, baby," Michelle said automatically, though she wondered sometimes if it might buy a little peace of mind. Just enough to stop worrying about every dollar, every meal, every day. Zara nodded, but she kept watching the people at the restaurant. She saw a man in a dark suit check his expensive watch and signal for the bill. She noticed how easily he pulled out his wallet, how he didn't count the money before handing it over. She wondered what it would feel like to never worry about having enough. As they moved past the restaurant, Zara spotted something that made her stop. Behind the building, near the dumpster, she saw pieces of bread that had been thrown away. Not moldy or dirty. Fresh bread that looked like it had just been tossed because it was left over from lunch service. "Mama, wait," she said quietly. Michelle followed her daughter's gaze and felt her stomach drop. "Zara, no, we're not that desperate." But they were, and they both knew it. Tomorrow was Sunday, and the food pantry at the church was closed. They had crackers and half a jar of peanut butter at home. That was it. Monday seemed very far away when your daughter's stomach was growling, and you had no way to fill it. "It's still good bread, Mama," Zara said practically. "It's wasteful to let it go bad when people are hungry." Zara had always been practical like that. She didn't see shame in taking what others had thrown away if it meant they could eat. Michelle saw the logic, but she also saw the danger. What if someone saw them? What if someone called the police? What if Zara's school found out? Before Michelle could stop her, Zara walked toward the alley. That's when the laughter started. 3 men in expensive suits had come out the back door of the restaurant, probably having just finished their business lunch. They saw this little black girl approaching their dumpster, and something about the situation struck them as amusing. "Look at this," one of them said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I guess the rumors about this neighborhood are true." Richard Stone, the tallest of the 3, had just closed a deal worth $12 million for Stone Industries. He was feeling generous, invincible, like the world was his playground. He had started his tech company with a small loan from his father 20 years ago, and now it was worth more than some small countries. He lived in a mansion in Buckhead, drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, and had never known what it felt like to wonder where his next meal would come from. He saw an opportunity for what he thought was harmless fun. "Hey, little girl," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone rich people use when they think they're being charitable. "You hungry?" Zara stopped and looked at him. She didn't answer immediately, which seemed to amuse him more. She was studying his face, trying to understand why he was smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Tell you what," Richard continued, pulling out his wallet and making sure his friends could see the thick stack of bills inside. "Eat from the trash, and I'll give you $1. His friends laughed. One of them, a red-faced man who smelled like whiskey even though it was only 3 in the afternoon, slapped Richard on the back. "Make it interesting, Stone. Make it $5. Michelle felt humiliation burn through her chest like fire. She started pushing her wheelchair forward as fast as she could, but the uneven pavement made it difficult. The wheels kept getting stuck in cracks, and her hands were already sore from the long walk. That's when Zara spoke. Before we continue with the story, don't forget to leave a comment telling us from which city you're watching. We're always happy to know where you're joining us from. My mama taught me something, mister, Zara said quietly, her voice cutting through their laughter like a knife. She said dignity isn't something you can buy or sell. And it's definitely not something you can take away from someone, no matter how much money you have. The laughter stopped instantly. Richard Stone felt his smile freeze on his face. This little girl, standing in an alley where she shouldn't have to be, had just said something that hit him harder than any business deal ever could. His friends stopped chuckling and looked uncomfortable, suddenly aware that their joke had taken an unexpected turn. She also taught me, Zara continued, her voice steady and clear, that when someone tries to make you feel small, it's usually because they're trying to make themselves feel big. But real big people don't need to do that. Michelle finally reached them, her wheelchair bumping over the uneven pavement. Her face was flushed with embarrassment and anger, but there was something else there too. Pride. Her 8-year-old daughter was standing up to a grown man in a way that Michelle herself might not have been able to do. Zara, come here, Michelle said softly, but Zara didn't move. Richard Stone stood there, wallet still in his hand, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He had expected tears, maybe anger, or even acceptance of his cruel offer. He had not expected wisdom. He had not expected to feel ashamed. How old are you? He asked, and for the first time, his voice didn't have that mocking tone. 8, Zara replied simply. 8, Richard repeated, more to himself than to anyone else. When he was 8, his biggest worry was whether his father would buy him the new bicycle he wanted for his birthday. This girl was 8 and talking about dignity like she had lived 100 years. His friends were getting restless. The red-faced man who had suggested raising the stakes was now looking at his watch and muttering about getting back to the office. The third man, younger and clearly uncomfortable, was already walking toward their car. Richard, we should go, the red-faced man said. The meeting with the Henderson group is in 30 minutes. But Richard couldn't move. He was staring at this little girl who had just delivered the most profound lesson he had heard in years, and she had done it without raising her voice, without cursing, without any of the anger he probably deserved. What's your name? He asked. Zara Johnson, she replied, then gestured toward Michelle. This is my mama, Michelle Johnson. Richard looked at Michelle for the first time, really looked at her. He saw a woman probably in her 30s, with tired eyes but good posture. Her clothes were clean but worn. Her hands, he noticed, had calluses from pushing her wheelchair. There was dignity in the way she sat, even in the middle of this humiliating situation. Mrs. Johnson, he said, and his voice was different now. Quieter, more respectful. I apologize. That was inappropriate. Michelle studied his face, looking for signs of sarcasm or another cruel joke. She found none. Apology accepted, she said simply. The silence stretched between them. Richard's friends were now openly impatient, and he could hear one of them starting the car. But something was happening inside Richard that he didn't understand. This moment felt important in a way that his $12 million deal hadn't. Do you need help? He asked awkwardly. The question sounded strange coming from him. When was the last time he had asked someone if they needed help? When was the last time he had even noticed that someone might need help? We're fine, Michelle said quickly, the automatic response of someone who had learned not to depend on the kindness of strangers. But Zara, still looking directly at Richard, said something that stopped everyone cold. Actually, Mama, we're not fine. We're hungry, and we're scared about next week's rent, and you're too proud to say it, but I'm not. She turned back to Richard. But that doesn't mean we need your pity, mister. It just means we're going through a hard time, and hard times don't last forever. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. When was the last time someone had spoken to him with such honesty? In his world of business meetings and carefully worded contracts, people told him what they thought he wanted to hear. This child was telling him the truth, raw and unfiltered. Richard, his red-faced friend called from the car. We're leaving. Go ahead, Richard called back, not taking his eyes off Zara and Michelle. I'll catch up. The car engine revved, and his friends drove away, leaving Richard standing alone in the alley with a woman in a wheelchair and an 8-year-old girl who had just given him the most important business lesson of his life. Sometimes the most valuable things can't be bought. Why did you say that? Richard asked Zara. About dignity, I mean. Where did you learn that? Zara looked at her mother, then back at him. My grandma used to say it. She cleaned houses for rich people for 40 years. She said some of them treated her real nice, and some of them treated her like she was invisible. But she said it didn't matter how they treated her, because she knew who she was inside. Richard thought about his own grandmother, who had died when he was in college. She had been a teacher in a small town, and she used to tell him stories about her students. She always said that the smartest kids weren't always the ones with the most money. They were the ones who asked the best questions. Zara was asking him questions he didn't know how to answer. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman," Richard said. "She was," Zara nodded. "She taught me to read before I even started school. She said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you." Michelle watched this exchange with growing amazement. Her daughter was having a conversation with a wealthy stranger like they were equals, and somehow the stranger was letting her. More than that, he seemed to be listening, really listening. "Do you like school?" Richard asked. Zara's face lit up for the first time since the conversation began. "I love school. I'm in 3rd grade, but my teacher says I read like a 5th grader. I want to be a teacher like my grandma was, or maybe a doctor so I can help people like the doctors who tried to help my mama." The doctors who tried to help. Richard realized that Michelle's disability wasn't something she was born with. Something had happened to her. Something that had changed everything for this little family. "What happened?" he asked Michelle gently. "If you don't mind me asking." Michelle hesitated, then decided that if her 8-year-old could be brave enough to tell the truth, she could too. "Car accident 2 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light. I was walking to work at the diner where I was a waitress. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive, but some days it doesn't feel very lucky." Richard felt the weight of those words. Lucky to be alive, but struggling to live. He thought about his own problems, difficult board meetings, tough negotiations, stock prices. None of it seemed very important right now. "The insurance didn't cover everything?" he asked. Michelle almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "The insurance covered just enough to keep me from dying. Everything else, the wheelchair, the physical therapy, the modifications we needed for our apartment, that all came out of our savings. What little we had. And now? Now we take it one day at a time," Michelle said simply. "Some days are harder than others." Richard looked around the alley, really seeing it for the first time. The dumpster he had pointed to was overflowing with food waste from the restaurant. Perfectly good bread, vegetables that were slightly wilted, fruits with small blemishes. Enough food to feed a family for days, thrown away because it wasn't perfect enough for paying customers. He thought about his own kitchen at home, which was always stocked with more food than he could eat. His housekeeper threw away leftovers regularly because he rarely ate the same meal twice. The waste had never bothered him before, but now it felt obscene. "Zara," he said quietly, "what you said about dignity, do you really believe that? Even when things are hard?" Zara nodded seriously. "Grandma used to say that being poor doesn't make you less of a person. It just makes you a person with less money. She said the real measure of a person isn't what they have, it's what they do when they have the chance to help someone else." Those words hit Richard like a physical blow. What they do when they have the chance to help someone else. When was the last time he had helped someone who couldn't do something for him in return? When was the last time he had even noticed someone who needed help? He looked at his expensive watch, a Rolex that cost more than most people made in a year. His friends were probably already at their next meeting, talking about him like he had lost his mind. Tomorrow, this would be a funny story to them. The time Richard Stone had a conversation with a homeless family in an alley. But it didn't feel funny to Richard. It felt like the most important conversation he had had in years. "Mrs. Johnson," he said finally. "Zara, I don't know what to say. I came out here thinking I was going to have a laugh at someone else's expense, and instead, I got schooled by an 8-year-old. Zara smiled for the first time, a real smile that reached her eyes. "My grandma would have liked you, mister. She always said that people who can admit when they're wrong are the ones worth knowing." Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The desire to be worthy of a compliment. This little girl thought her grandmother would have liked him, and somehow that mattered more than any business award he had ever received. "Richard Stone," he said, extending his hand to Michelle, then crouching down to shake Zara's small hand. "And I think I would have liked your grandmother too." That night, Richard Stone sat in his home office, staring at the city lights through his floor-to-ceiling windows. His mansion in Buckhead was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. The house had 12 rooms, and most nights he only used 2 of them, his bedroom and this office. His housekeeper, Maria, had left dinner in the refrigerator as always, but he wasn't hungry. He couldn't stop thinking about Zara's words. Real big people don't need to make others feel small. The simple truth of it had been echoing in his head for hours. He had built his entire business empire on being the smartest person in the room, on finding weaknesses in his competitors, on winning at any cost. But what Zara had shown him wasn't winning. It was bullying. His phone buzzed with messages from his friends from the restaurant. Mark, the red-faced one, had sent 3 texts asking if he was feeling okay, and suggesting he not let some street kid get in his head. The younger one, James, had sent a more thoughtful message. That little girl really made us look bad today. Maybe we deserved it. Richard didn't respond to any of them. Instead, he found himself thinking about his own childhood. His father had been wealthy, but he had also been kind. Richard remembered visiting a soup kitchen with his parents every Christmas, remembered his mother taking clothes to shelters, remembered his father always treating service workers with respect. When had he lost that? When had he become the kind of person who would mock a hungry child? The success had come gradually, and with it, a hardening of his heart that he hadn't even noticed. Each deal made him more confident. Each victory made him feel more superior. Each $1 million made him feel more entitled. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that not everyone had the same advantages he did. His computer was open to Stone Industries' financial reports, but instead of reading them, he found himself researching something else. Disability services in Atlanta, food assistance programs, housing for low-income families. The waiting lists were months long. The funding was insufficient. The requirements were strict and often excluded people who desperately needed help but made just a few dollars too much to qualify. He learned that Michelle would be lucky to receive $60 a month in food assistance. $60. He spent more than that on a single lunch at Meridian. The unfairness of it hit him like a physical weight. Meanwhile, across town, Zara and Michelle were sitting in their small apartment, sharing a dinner of crackers and the last of their peanut butter. The bread from the alley had been forgotten in all the drama of the afternoon, but neither of them mentioned it. "Mama," Zara said quietly, "do you think we'll be okay?" Michelle looked at her daughter, this beautiful, smart, brave little girl who was asking questions no 8-year-old should have to ask. "We've been okay so far, haven't we?" "I guess," Zara said, but her voice was small. "I just wish you didn't look so worried all the time." Michelle's heart clenched. She tried so hard to hide her fears from Zara, but children see everything. "I worry because I love you, baby. That's what mamas do." "I love you too," Zara said, curling up next to her mother's wheelchair. "And I think that man today learned something important." "What do you mean?" "He wasn't really mean, Mama. He was just forgotten. Forgotten what it feels like to be kind. Grandma used to say that sometimes people need to be reminded of who they really are inside." Michelle marveled at her daughter's wisdom. Even after being humiliated, Zara could find compassion for the man who had tried to humiliate her. It was a grace that Michelle wasn't sure she possessed. The next morning was Monday, and Zara had school. She loved school, even though it sometimes highlighted everything they didn't have. While other kids brought elaborate lunches, Zara brought a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a paper towel. While other kids wore new clothes, Zara wore hand-me-downs from the church donation box. But none of that mattered when she was learning. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was a kind woman in her 50s who had noticed that Zara was special. She read above grade level, helped other students with their math, and asked questions that showed deep thinking. Mrs. Patterson had tried to recommend Zara for the gifted program, but it required testing fees that Michelle couldn't afford. "Zara," Mrs. Patterson said as the class worked on their reading assignment, "could you help Michael with his spelling words? You're so good at explaining things." Zara nodded eagerly. She loved helping other kids learn. It made her feel useful, important, like she had something valuable to offer even if she didn't have much money. During lunch, while other kids played on the playground, Zara usually sat under a tree and read library books. She had checked out every book about teaching that the school library had. She dreamed of having her own classroom someday, of helping kids learn the way Mrs. Patterson helped her. But today was different. Today, a black car pulled up to the school office, and a man in an expensive suit walked inside. Richard Stone had spent the entire morning thinking about Zara and Michelle. He had canceled 2 meetings and delayed a conference call with investors in California. His assistant, Jennifer, kept asking if he was feeling well because this behavior was completely unlike him. He had called the school pretending to be interested in making a donation, and they had eagerly told him about their programs, their needs, their students. When he asked about exceptional students who might need financial assistance, they immediately mentioned Zara Johnson. "She's remarkable," the principal, Dr. Williams, had said over the phone. "One of the brightest students we've had in years, but her family situation is challenging. Her mother was in an accident, and they're struggling financially. We've tried to help where we can, but there are limits to what the school can do." Now Richard was sitting in Dr. Williams's office, feeling nervous in a way he hadn't felt since his first big business presentation 20 years ago. "Mr. Stone," Dr. Williams said, "I have to say, we're honored that someone of your stature is interested in our school. Your donation could really make a difference for our students. Richard shifted in his chair. Actually, Dr. Williams, I'm not here to make a general donation. I'm here about one specific student, Zara Johnson. Dr. Williams's eyebrows rose. Zara? Do you know the family? We met recently, Richard said carefully. I was impressed by Zara's intelligence and character. I'd like to help, but I want to do it right. What does she need? What does her family need? Dr. Williams leaned back in his chair. Where do I start? Zara qualifies for our gifted program, but there are fees involved. She could benefit from tutoring, but her mother can't afford it. She reads constantly, but she doesn't have books at home. Her mother is brilliant too, from what I can tell, but she never finished college because of financial constraints. What about long term? What would it take to really change their situation? Dr. Williams was quiet for a moment. Honestly, Zara has the potential to get into any college in the country, but college costs money. Her mother could probably finish her degree if she had help with childcare and tuition. They need stable housing, reliable transportation, health insurance that actually covers their needs. Richard nodded slowly. He was taking mental notes, already formulating a plan. But Mr. Stone, Dr. Williams continued, if you're thinking about helping them, you should know that Michelle Johnson is proud. She won't accept charity. Whatever you do, it has to be done in a way that preserves their dignity. Dignity. There was that word again. What if it wasn't charity? Richard asked. What if it was an investment, or a scholarship, or a job opportunity? Dr. Williams smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Now you're thinking like someone who understands this family. They talked for another hour, developing ideas, discussing possibilities. Richard learned that Michelle had been 2 semesters away from finishing her business degree when she had to drop out to work full-time. He learned that Zara tested at a 9th grade reading level despite being in 3rd grade. He learned that both mother and daughter volunteered at the church food pantry every Saturday, even though they often needed the food pantry themselves. The more he learned, the more ashamed he felt about his behavior the day before. But shame, he realized, was just the beginning. What mattered now was what he did next. You know, we've got to say, the best part of this story is still coming. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the perfect time to hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss how this all unfolds. Trust us. What happens next will surprise you. When school ended that afternoon, Richard was waiting in the parking lot. Not in his usual flashy sports car, but in a simple black sedan. He saw Zara walking toward the bus stop, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her head buried in a library book as she walked. Zara, he called out, rolling down his window. She looked up, surprised. Mr. Stone? What are you doing here? I wanted to talk to you and your mother, he said. Is it okay if I give you a ride home? Zara studied his face, looking for signs of the mockery from yesterday. She found none. Okay, she said, getting into the passenger seat. But my mama doesn't like surprises. I understand, Richard said. That's why I'm asking your permission first. I have an idea that might help your family, but I want to make sure it's something you'd want before I talk to your mother about it. As they drove through Atlanta traffic, Richard found himself looking at the city differently. He noticed the bus stops where people waited in the heat, the apartment buildings with peeling paint, the corner stores with bars on the windows. He had driven through these neighborhoods 1,000 times without really seeing them. Mr. Stone, Zara said quietly, are you going to try to give us money? The question was so direct it caught him off guard. Would that be a bad thing? Zara considered this carefully. My mama says that handouts make people feel small, but hand-ups make people feel strong. What's the difference between the two? Another profound question from an 8-year-old. I think, Richard said slowly, a handout is when someone gives you something because they feel sorry for you. A hand-up is when someone helps you become able to help yourself. Zara nodded approvingly. Then yes, I think we could use a hand-up. When they reached the apartment building, Richard looked up at the 3rd floor, imagining Michelle having to be carried up and down those stairs. He thought about his own house with its elevator, its ramps, its accessibility features that he had never given a second thought to. Will you come up and talk to my mama? Zara asked. Richard looked at the broken elevator, the narrow stairway, the challenges that would make it impossible for Michelle to come down to meet him. He had 2 choices, leave or figure out how to make this work. Zara, he said, could you ask your mother if she'd be willing to meet me somewhere that's easier for her wheelchair? Maybe the church you mentioned, or a restaurant with good accessibility. Zara smiled, and Richard realized he had passed another test he didn't know he was taking. 2 days later, they met at the First Baptist Church of Atlanta, a modest brick building in the heart of the community. Richard had suggested it after learning from Zara that they volunteered there every Saturday. The church had ramps, accessible bathrooms, and most importantly, It was a place where Michelle felt comfortable and respected. Pastor Williams, a gentleman in his 60s, had graciously offered his office for the meeting. "Michelle Johnson is one of our finest volunteers," he had told Richard over the phone. "That little girl of hers has a heart bigger than this whole building. Whatever you're planning to do for them, you've chosen well." Richard arrived 15 minutes early, sitting in his car and rehearsing what he wanted to say. He had spent the last 2 days putting together a proposal that he hoped would sound like opportunity rather than charity. His legal team thought he was crazy. His accountant had asked 3 times if he was sure about the numbers. His assistant had quietly suggested he might want to talk to someone about his sudden change in behavior. But Richard had never been more certain of anything in his life. Michelle wheeled into the church office with Zara beside her, both of them dressed in their Sunday best, even though it was a Wednesday afternoon. Michelle wore a navy blue dress that was several years old, but clean and pressed. Zara wore a yellow dress that was slightly too big for her, probably handed down from an older child, but she had paired it with bright white socks and her cleanest sneakers. "Mrs. Johnson," Richard stood up immediately. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. And Zara, you look very nice today." "Thank you," Zara replied politely, but her eyes were curious. She was studying Richard's face again, trying to read his intentions. Michelle had agreed to this meeting partly because Zara had asked her to, and partly because she was curious about what had changed in this man. The Richard Stone who had mocked them in the alley seemed like a different person from the one who had thoughtfully chosen an accessible meeting place and arrived with a folder full of papers instead of a wallet full of condescending offers. "Before we start," Michelle said, her voice steady and clear, "I want you to know that we're not looking for a handout. If that's what this is about, we can leave right now." Richard nodded respectfully. "I understand completely. And I want you to know that what I'm about to propose isn't charity. It's a business proposition that I hope will benefit both of us." Michelle's eyebrows rose slightly. "A business proposition?" Richard opened his folder and pulled out several documents. "Mrs. Johnson, I did some research after we met. I learned that you were studying business administration at Georgia State before your accident. You were 2 semesters away from graduating with a 3.8 GPA. Michelle's face tightened. "That was a long time ago." "Not that long ago," Richard said gently. "And intelligence doesn't have an expiration date. I also learned that you manage the finances for 3 different church ministries, that you organize the most successful fundraiser in this church's history, and that you've been helping other families navigate the disability services system even while dealing with your own challenges." Zara looked at her mother with obvious pride. "Mama helps everybody," she said simply. Richard smiled at Zara, then turned back to Michelle. "What I'm proposing is this. I'd like to hire you as a consultant for Stone Industries. Specifically, I want you to help me understand how businesses can better serve people with disabilities, how we can make our services more accessible, and how we can create programs that actually help families instead of just making us feel good about ourselves." Michelle stared at him. "You want to hire me?" "I want to hire you," Richard confirmed. "Full-time position, with benefits, with a salary that would allow you to finish your degree if you choose to. The job would involve research, writing reports, consulting with our development team, and yes, some travel to other companies who want to learn from our accessibility initiatives." Michelle was quiet for a long moment. "And what exactly makes you think I'm qualified for this position?" Richard leaned forward slightly. "Because 2 days ago, an 8-year-old girl taught me more about business ethics in 5 minutes than I learned in 4 years of business school. And she learned those principles from you. If you can raise a daughter with that much wisdom and integrity while dealing with everything you've been through, then you're exactly the kind of person I need working with me." Zara's face was bright with excitement, but Michelle still looked skeptical. "Mr. Stone, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not naive. You felt guilty about what happened in that alley, and now you're trying to make yourself feel better. This job you're describing, it doesn't really exist, does it?" Richard had expected this question, and he was prepared for it. "You're absolutely right that I felt guilty, but you're wrong about the job not existing. Let me show you something." He pulled out his laptop and opened a presentation. "This is my company's accessibility audit from last year. We spent $2 million on what we thought were accessibility improvements. But do you know what the actual impact was? Almost zero. You want to know why? Because we designed solutions for problems we imagined instead of problems that actually exist." He clicked to the next slide, which showed survey results from people with disabilities who had tried to use his company's services. The feedback was overwhelmingly negative. "We failed because we didn't have anyone on our team who actually understood the challenges. We had good intentions, but good intentions without real knowledge are useless." Michelle leaned forward, studying the data. Despite herself, she was interested. "These numbers are terrible," she said. "Exactly. And that's why I need you. Not because I feel guilty, but because my company is failing an entire segment of the population, and that failure is costing us money, credibility, and most importantly, The chance to actually make a difference. Richard clicked to another slide showing projected costs and potential improvements. I've already spoken with my board of directors. This position has been approved, budgeted, and frankly, is long overdue. If you don't take it, I'll have to find someone else with your qualifications. But I'd much rather work with someone whose insights I've already witnessed firsthand. Michelle studied the presentation, asking detailed questions about budget, timeline, and expectations. Richard found himself impressed by her business acumen. She understood financial projections, questioned assumptions, and suggested improvements to his initial plans. It was clear that her unfinished degree hadn't stopped her from continuing to learn and grow. "What about Zara?" Michelle asked finally. "This job sounds like it would require travel, long hours. I can't do anything that would interfere with being her mother." "I thought about that too," Richard said, pulling out another document. "The company has an excellent childcare program, and for business travel, we would provide childcare or arrange for family-friendly accommodations. But more than that, I'd like to discuss something else with you." He turned to Zara. "Zara, your teacher tells me you're reading at a 9th grade level. Is that true?" Zara nodded, suddenly shy about being the center of attention. "And you want to be a teacher someday?" Another nod. "Well, I think we can do better than that. I think you should consider being a professor or maybe running your own school. But either way, you're going to need a great education." He pulled out another folder. "I'd like to propose a full scholarship for Zara, not just for private school through high school, but for college, graduate school, whatever she wants to pursue." Zara's eyes went wide. "Really? Really? But there are conditions." Richard's voice became serious. "You have to keep up your grades. You have to continue helping other students learn, and you have to promise me that someday, when you're successful, you'll help another child the way I'm trying to help you now." "That's easy," Zara said immediately. "I already help kids at school, and Grandma always said that when you're blessed, you bless others." Michelle felt tears threatening to spill over. "Mr. Stone, this is too much. I don't understand why you're doing this." Richard was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. "Mrs. Johnson, I've been successful in business for 20 years. I've made more money than I can spend in a lifetime. I've won awards, closed big deals, impressed important people. But do you know what? None of that ever made me feel the way I felt when your daughter looked me in the eye and told me that dignity can't be bought or sold." He paused, looking at both of them. "I realize that I've spent 20 years building a fortune, but I've never built anything that really mattered. Your daughter taught me what success actually looks like, and it doesn't look like humiliating people in alleys. It looks like using whatever power you have to lift others up." Michelle wiped her eyes, trying to maintain her composure. "And if I take this job, if we accept this scholarship, what happens when you get bored with us? What happens when helping us stops making you feel good about yourself?" It was a fair question, and Richard respected her for asking it. "Then you'll have a year's worth of business experience at a major company, a completed degree, and excellent references. Zara will have a year of the best education money can buy. Even if I disappeared tomorrow, you'd both be better off than you are today." He leaned forward, his voice becoming more earnest. "But Mrs. Johnson, I don't think I'm going to get bored. I think working with you is going to be the most meaningful thing I've ever done with my career. I think watching Zara grow and learn is going to remind me every day of why success actually matters." Zara, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "Mama, I think we should say yes." Michelle looked at her daughter. "Why, baby?" "Because Grandma used to say that when God sends help, you don't ask him to send it in a different package. And besides," Zara grinned, "I think Mr. Stone needs us just as much as we need him." Richard laughed, a genuine sound of pure joy. "You know what, Zara? You're absolutely right." Michelle looked around the church office, thinking about all the prayers she had whispered in this building, all the nights she had wondered how she was going to provide for her daughter, all the times she had felt like the world had forgotten them. Now, here was an opportunity that seemed too good to be true, offered by a man who had started as an enemy and somehow become something else entirely. "There's one more thing," Richard said quietly. "I want you both to know that if you say yes to this, you're not just employees or scholarship recipients. You're going to be part of changing how my company thinks about everything we do. You're going to help us become the kind of business that actually makes the world better instead of just making money." Michelle took a deep breath. "Mr. Stone, if we do this, we do it right. No special treatment because you feel sorry for us. No lowered expectations because of my disability. If I'm going to work for you, I'm going to be the best consultant you've ever had." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Richard replied. "And if Zara is going to take this scholarship, she's going to earn it every single day. No free rides." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Zara said seriously. Michelle looked at her daughter, then at Richard, then back at her daughter. Finally, she extended her hand. Mr. Stone, I think we have a deal. As they shook hands, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. And judging by the smiles on Zara and Michelle's faces, they felt the same way. 6 months later, Richard Stone stood in front of the mirror in his office bathroom, adjusting his tie before the biggest presentation of his career. Today, he was presenting Stone Industries' new accessibility initiative to a room full of business leaders, disability advocates, and media representatives. And sitting in the front row would be Michelle Johnson, his director of accessibility services, and her daughter Zara. The transformation had been remarkable for everyone involved. Michelle had thrown herself into her new role with the determination of someone who had been waiting her whole life for the right opportunity. Her first report had been devastating and brilliant, exposing failures in the entire industry. Her recommendations had been practical, cost-effective, and revolutionary. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, she had told the board during her first presentation. We just need to ask the people who actually use the wheel what works and what doesn't. Her methodical approach had already resulted in 3 major improvements to their services. Zara had blossomed at her new school. The advanced program challenged her intellectually while giving her individual attention. She had found her voice as a leader, starting a tutoring program where older students helped younger ones, insisting it be open to students from all economic backgrounds. Smart doesn't cost money, she had told the school principal, and helping others makes everyone smarter. The program was now being implemented in 3 other schools across the district. But perhaps the biggest change had been in Richard himself. Working with Michelle had opened his eyes to entire communities he had never considered. His company was now seen as a leader in accessibility, not just in services, but in hiring practices. As he walked to the podium, Richard caught sight of Michelle in the audience. She wore a professional navy suit, her hair styled elegantly, a small smile of encouragement on her face. Beside her, Zara sat in her school uniform, a notebook in her lap. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what success looked like. I had built a profitable company, accumulated wealth, and earned respect. But I was wrong about success, and it took an 8-year-old girl to teach me what I had been missing. He clicked to his first slide, showing a photo of himself, Michelle, and Zara. This is Michelle Johnson, our Director of Accessibility Services, and her daughter, Zara. Michelle has revolutionized how our company serves all customers. But more than that, she has revolutionized how I think about what business is supposed to accomplish. The audience was attentive, but Richard could see some puzzled faces. Corporate presentations didn't usually begin with personal stories. 6 months ago, I made one of the worst decisions of my career. I encountered this family during a difficult moment, and instead of offering help, I offered humiliation. I thought it would be funny to mock a child who was hungry. A murmur went through the audience. Richard's vulnerability was unexpected. But that little girl looked me in the eye and said something that changed everything. She said that dignity isn't something you can buy or sell, and that real big people don't need to make others feel small. In that moment, an 8-year-old child taught me more about leadership than I had learned in 20 years of business. Richard clicked to the next slide, showing statistics. When we started working with Michelle, our accessibility compliance rate was 37%. Today, it's 94%. Our customer satisfaction among people with disabilities has increased by 240%. The numbers got their attention. Business leaders understood results. Here's what we learned. When you design for people with disabilities, you create better solutions for everyone. When you hire people with disabilities, you help your entire organization become more creative and effective. When you include people who have been excluded, everyone wins. Richard spent the next 20 minutes presenting concrete data and practical strategies, but he kept coming back to the human element, to stories of individuals whose lives had been changed by simple acts of inclusion and respect. The Stone Foundation is committing $50 million over the next 5 years to expand these programs nationwide, Richard announced. But money alone won't change anything. What we need is a fundamental shift in how we think about human potential and human dignity. When he finished, the applause was immediate and sustained. During the reception afterward, Richard found himself surrounded by business leaders, asking questions and offering partnerships. Later that evening, the 3 of them sat in a quiet restaurant, celebrating the success of the presentation. Zara was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. "Mama, did you hear what Mrs. Davidson said? She wants to start a program like ours in Chicago, and that man from the newspaper wants to write a story about our tutoring program." Michelle laughed. "I heard, baby. You're going to be famous." "We're all going to be famous," Zara corrected. "But the good kind of famous, where people remember us for helping instead of just having money." Richard raised his glass of water in a toast. "To teachers," he said. Both the ones in classrooms and the ones we meet in alleys. To second chances, Michelle added. To dignity, Zara said solemnly, making the adults smile at her seriousness. As they clinked glasses, Richard reflected on how different his life had become. His house was still big, his bank account was still substantial, but now those things felt like tools rather than trophies. He had purpose beyond profit, relationships that mattered more than networking. Mr. Stone, Zara said as they finished their meal, can I ask you something? Of course. That day in the alley, when you offered me money to eat from the trash, did you really think I would do it? Richard considered the question carefully. I don't know, Zara. I think I was so disconnected from reality that I didn't really think about what you would do. I was only thinking about what would amuse me. Zara nodded thoughtfully. Well, I'm glad you asked me to do something awful, because it gave me the chance to say something important. And I'm glad you were smart enough to listen. You're glad I was awful to you? Not glad you were awful, Zara clarified, but glad that being awful led to something good. Grandma used to say that sometimes God uses our worst moments to create our best opportunities. Michelle reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. Your grandma would be so proud of you, baby. She'd be proud of all of us, Zara replied. Mr. Stone, do you think you would have started helping people if we hadn't met that day? Richard was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I don't think so. I was so focused on accumulating wealth that I had forgotten why wealth might matter. You reminded me that the point of having power is to use it to help people who don't have power. And you reminded us, Michelle said, that there are people with good hearts even in places where we might not expect to find them. As they left the restaurant, Richard offered to drive them home, but Michelle declined. We've got our own car now, she said with obvious pride. The company car was equipped with hand controls that made it possible for Michelle to drive independently for the first time since her accident. Richard watched them drive away, then sat in his own car for a few minutes, thinking about freedom. He had thought he was free when he had enough money to do whatever he wanted. But real freedom came from knowing that what you wanted was worth wanting. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues congratulating him on the presentation. But the message that mattered most was a simple text from Zara. Thank you for listening that day. Thank you for learning. Thank you for helping us help others. Richard typed back. Thank you for teaching me what success really looks like. As he drove home through Atlanta, Richard found himself noticing things he had missed before. A bus stop where people waited patiently. A small restaurant where families shared meals they had worked hard to afford. A park where children of all backgrounds played together. The city looked the same, but Richard saw it differently now. He saw people instead of problems, potential instead of obstacles, opportunities to help instead of reasons to ignore. When he reached his mansion, Richard didn't go straight inside. Instead, he sat on his front steps and called his assistant. Jennifer, I want you to schedule a meeting with the board for next week. I have another proposal for them. Another accessibility initiative? Something bigger, Richard said. I want to talk about changing our entire corporate mission statement. I want to make it clear that our goal isn't just to be profitable, but to be meaningful. That night, for the first time in months, Richard didn't work late. Instead, he sat reading a book that Zara had recommended. The inscription she had written touched him. For Mr. Stone, who learned that the best teachers are often the smallest people with the biggest hearts. The next morning, Richard woke up eager to get to work, not because he had deals to close, but because he had people to help and a mission to fulfill. Michelle would be presenting her next report, and Zara had invited him to speak at her school's career day. As he got dressed, Richard looked at himself in the mirror and saw someone he recognized but hadn't seen in years. A man with purpose, a leader with compassion, a person who understood that true success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. And it had all started with a little girl's wisdom about dignity, delivered in an alley behind a restaurant where he had tried to make her eat from the trash. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, and sometimes the best thing that can happen to a successful person is to meet someone who shows them what success actually means. What did you think of this incredible journey? How did Zara's words about dignity and Richard's transformation touch your heart? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like this remind us that one moment of courage can change everything, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages. If this story inspired you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of dignity, second chances, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Until next time, remember that dignity isn't something that can be bought or sold. It's something we all deserve, and something we all have the power to give to others.